Irene Caldwell found the letter on a Thursday morning in October, tucked between 2 pages of her husband's medical journal on the third shelf of his study, and she read it in 40 seconds, standing at his desk, in her morning dress with the autumn light coming flat through the window. And understood in those 40 seconds that the 18 months of her marriage had been built the same way a stage set is built, with careful attention to what the audience is supposed to see, and none at all to what is standing behind the flats. She did not cry, she did not sit down, she read it a second time, set the letter back exactly as she had found it, between pages 214 and 215 of Monroe's copy of Gray's Anatomy, walked out of the study, and went to find Mrs. Fowler. If you are new here, please subscribe to Victorian Souls and stay with Irene's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what state you are watching from. I want to see how far this travels. Mrs. Fowler had been with the Brant family for 28 years. She had managed the household on Marlborough Street through the death of Irene's mother, when Irene was 11, through her father's long illness, through the funeral arrangements that followed his death 14 months ago. Quietly, efficiently, with the particular loyalty of a woman who had decided long ago that this family was worth her best efforts. When Irene appeared in the kitchen doorway that Thursday morning, Mrs. Fowler looked up from the delivery ledger she was checking, and something in her expression sharpened in the way. It sharpened when something important was happening that she had not yet been told about. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, not a question. "Mrs. Fowler." Irene kept her voice the voice she used when she was going through numbers that didn't balance, steady, unhurried. "The household visitor log. The one you maintain for this house. Does it go back before my marriage?" "Since 1879. I need to see the entries from February and March of 1887. Mrs. Fowler was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she went to the pantry cabinet, to a shelf behind the preserved goods, and produced a slender-bound book with dates written on the spine in her small, exact hand. Irene found the entries herself. February 12, 1887, Webb Caldwell, business 2 hours, departed 4 p.m. February 28, dined, departed 9 p.m. March 9th, Webb Caldwell and C. Dodd papers reviewed, departed 3 p.m. She had met Monroe for the first time on June 4, 1887, at a dinner party on Beacon Hill arranged by a mutual acquaintance, or so she had been told. She had met Monroe's Uncle Webb 2 weeks after that, at a Sunday lunch to which she had been specifically invited, which at the time had felt like ordinary courtesy. "You kept these entries," Irene said. "Your father asked me to keep them." Mrs. Fowler paused. "He said that anyone who came to this house asking questions about the estate finances should be written down by name and date. He didn't say why. He didn't need to." Irene set the visitor log on the kitchen table. "What else did my father ask you to keep?" Mrs. Fowler went back to the pantry cabinet, to a different shelf, behind the spice tins, and produced a folded envelope. Inside it was a single page from a ledger Irene had never seen. Not the main railroad ledger she had managed since her father's death, but a smaller personal record her father had kept separately. At the bottom of the page, in Leonard Brant's handwriting, was a notation dated 8 months before he died. Dodd. Approached through the Colonial Trust Exchange, inquiring, structure of the Brant Railroad shares, and succession provisions, do not engage, do not trust. Her father had known. He had identified Chester Dodd as a threat 8 months before his death, and then he had died, and the warning had stayed in an envelope behind the spice tins, waiting for a morning that had finally come. Irene held the page and let herself feel for exactly 1 minute the full weight of what had nearly happened. Then she folded it, put it in the pocket of her morning dress, and went to write a letter to Judge Stanton. She had always understood that she was a woman worth pursuing. That was not vanity, it was arithmetic. Leonard Brant had spent 30 years building the Consolidated Railroad shares, from a single freight contract between Springfield and Worcester, into one of the most reliable freight operations in New England, and when he died he had left all of it, not to a distant cousin, not to a board of trustees, but to Irene, his only child. An inheritance of that size, in Boston in 1887, made a woman visible in ways she had learned to account for the same way she accounted for everything else her father had taught her to account for, plainly, without sentiment, with her eyes open. What she had not accounted for was Monroe. She had met him believing the meeting was accidental. She had liked him because he asked sharp questions about freight pricing, without pretending to already know the answers. Because he looked at her ledgers with genuine attention rather than performed respect. Because he laughed at his own mistakes before anyone else could, and did not appear to find her intelligence inconvenient. She had married him without love. The arrangement had been her father's oldest attorney's suggestion. A sound match, a man of standing and discretion. But she had begun, over 18 months, to build something that was not love but was adjacent to it in a way she had not let herself examine closely. Trust was the word. She had begun to trust Monroe Caldwell. That was the part of the October morning that would cost her the longest to examine honestly. She found Monroe that evening in his medical study, writing case notes in the careful slanted hand she had spent 18 months watching move across pages without knowing what she was actually looking at. He looked up when she came in, and his expression shifted, not alarm, but the careful attention of a man who has been anticipating a conversation he cannot entirely avoid. Irene sat in the chair across from his desk. She did not produce the letter, not yet. Webb came to this house in February and March of 1887, she said, with Chester Dodd, 4 months before we met. Monroe was very still. I found the visitor log, she said, and my father's notation about Dodd, and a letter in your medical journal, between pages 214 and 215, written by your uncle to Chester Dodd, in which he describes, in specific language, a plan to transfer my father's railroad shares into a joint marital trust that Dodd would administer through a holding company. She paused. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer me honestly, because I think that is still something you are capable of. He waited. Did you know? Monroe Caldwell was 34 years old and had built a medical practice on the principle that a plain, honest diagnosis was worth more than 6 comfortable evasions. He had held to that principle through difficult cases and families who did not want the truth. He looked at Irene now and understood with the particular clarity of a man who has been actively avoiding clarity that he had not been holding to that principle at home. Not all of it, he said. Webb arranged our introduction. He told me he thought we would suit each other, that you were a woman of sound judgment and that I was. He stopped. He said I was the right kind of man for your situation. I told myself that was matchmaking. And the trust documents, the amendments he brought you in April. A silence. I read the first 2 pages, Monroe said. I did not read the rest. Because you didn't want to know what was in the rest. He held her gaze and said nothing, because he was not the kind of man who filled difficult silences with words that were not true. That is not the same as not knowing, Irene said. Monroe said, no, it is not. The room held that for a moment. I am not going to ask you to undo what you did and did not do, Irene said. I am going to tell you what I intend to do, and I need to know whether you are going to be in my way. Monroe looked at her steadily. No, he said, I am not. Good. Irene rose from the chair. Then move. I need to write 2 letters. He moved. Judge Stanton had been Leonard Brandt's attorney for 22 years, the particular kind of honest that her father had always sought out. Plain-spoken, unhurried, and entirely unconcerned with flattering the people across the table from him. He came to Marlborough Street the following morning, reviewed the letter, the visitor log entries, and her father's notation, and sat back with the expression of a man revising a number considerably upward. Chester Dodd, he said, has operated in this city and in Providence for the better part of a decade. He is meticulous about staying inside the law and equally meticulous about finding arrangements that accomplish outside the law what he cannot do within it. He set the papers down. There was a widow in Providence, a Mrs. Holbrook, née Mina Fiske, who lost her shipping stocks 3 years ago in a trust arrangement that Dodd facilitated. The structure was legal. The intent was not. She pursued it through the courts, and the courts could not help her, because everything had been signed voluntarily. Irene felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear, something more specific and more focused than fear, and she never recovered the stocks. No, Stanton said. Get me her address, Irene said. She wrote to Mina Holbrook that afternoon, plainly and without softening the facts, and asked one direct question. Would she be willing to provide a sworn account of the Providence arrangement in support of a formal complaint against Chester Dodd, to be filed with the Suffolk County Courts? She sealed the letter and sent it with her fastest messenger. Then she turned to the matter immediately in front of her. The Brandt Railroad Board was scheduled to meet the following Tuesday. Irene had attended the last 2 meetings as majority shareholder, which Webb Caldwell had made clear through 3 separate intermediaries he considered an unnecessary inconvenience. The Tuesday meeting had one item on its agenda: the vote to authorize the transfer of Irene's shares into the joint marital trust. Once those shares were in the trust, Monroe would be the primary administrator under Massachusetts law. And once Monroe was administrator, Webb and Dodd needed only Monroe's signature on a trust amendment to redirect the shares into a holding company they controlled. The plan was clean, it was legal. It had been constructed by men who knew exactly where the lines were and how to stand as close to them as possible without stepping across. Irene understood it completely. Her father had taught her to read financial structures the way other fathers taught their daughters to read music, as a language, as a skill, as something genuinely useful. She arrived at the board meeting 20 minutes early. The boardroom was on the second floor of a building on State Street, a long room with tall windows and a mahogany table her father had chosen himself 30 years ago. She could hear voices from the anteroom before she went in. Webb and Dodd, who had not yet heard her come up the stairs. Webb's voice carried easily through the half-open door. The voice of a man who had arranged things to his satisfaction and was now simply waiting for the mechanics to finish. "She won't contest the transfer," he said. "She hasn't the background for it." Leonard kept the business details away from her. That was his one significant error, as it turns out, but it serves us well enough now. A pause. "Women in her position trust the men their husbands trust. It's entirely reliable." Dodd's voice, "And if she questions the timeline?" Webb. Monroe reassures her. "That is the entire function of the arrangement. She married him. She believes in him. That is what makes this straightforward." Irene stood in the hallway outside the anteroom and let those words move through her, not as a wound but as information. She filed them carefully, the way she filed any fact she intended to use. Then she straightened her posture and walked into the boardroom. There were 7 men seated at the table, and they all looked up with the varied expressions of men who had expected Monroe Caldwell and received Irene instead. Webb was at the far end. Dodd sat beside him with a leather case on the table. "Mrs. Caldwell." Webb's voice was warm, genial, the voice of a man who had been charming rooms for 40 years. "We weren't expecting you this morning." "I know," Irene said. She sat at the head of the table, the chair designated for the majority shareholder, which no one had thought to offer her because no one had expected her to claim it. She opened the folio she had brought. Inside it, the letter, copied twice and witnessed, her father's ledger notation, signed and dated by Mrs. Fowler, and the visitor log entries, transcribed in Stanton's hand onto official letterhead. She placed them in the center of the table. "Before this board votes on anything this morning," she said, "I believe you need to understand what you are actually being asked to vote on." Dodd reached for the documents. She put her hand on them first. "This letter," she said, "was written by Webb Caldwell to Chester Dodd in January of 1887, 4 months before Monroe Caldwell and I were introduced at a dinner party in this city." She looked at the board members, men her father had chosen, men who had known Leonard Brandt for decades. In it, Webb describes a plan to transfer my father's railroad shares into a trust structure that Dodd would administer, following a marriage that they intended to arrange for that specific purpose. She kept her voice the voice she used for quarterly figures. Even, clear, unadorned. "That is not a marital trust arrangement. That is premeditated fraud against the legal heir of this railroad." The room was entirely silent. Webb's voice, when it came, was still smooth. "Irene, these are complicated financial instruments, and I understand they can appear." "Judge Stanton," Irene said. Stanton, who had been sitting quietly in the chair against the wall, the chair reserved for legal counsel, rose and moved to the table. He set a second document beside Irene's, the timeline he had prepared the previous evening, from the visitor log entries and the Colonial Trust exchange records, and her father's notation. He read it aloud in the careful, unhurried voice of 40 years in Massachusetts courtrooms. Webb Caldwell had first approached Chester Dodd about the Brandt Railroad shares in January of 1887. The introductory dinner at which Monroe Caldwell and Irene Brandt had supposedly met by chance had occurred in June of 1887. The visitor log showed Webb and Dodd at the Brandt household in the months between. At a house that belonged at that time to a woman who was a complete stranger to them. The timeline lay on the table. Dodd looked at Webb. Webb looked at the letter. His own handwriting, his own words. The evidence of a plan laid out with the particular confidence of men who do not expect to be caught. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt. Men who had operated as long as Webb operated did not produce guilt quickly, but the specific calculation of a man who is looking for the exit and finding that each one has been closed. "This is a misrepresentation of business correspondence," he said. The correspondence is in your handwriting, Irene said. The timeline is documented by a household log maintained continuously since 1879. My father's notation identifying Mr. Dodd as a financial threat was written 8 months before his death and kept in the safekeeping of a woman who has served this family for 28 years. She looked at Dodd and Mrs. Mina Holbrook of Providence, whose shipping stocks were redirected through a Dodd-administered trust 3 years ago under a structure that is substantially identical to the one described in this letter, arrived in Boston yesterday morning, and is prepared to give sworn testimony to that effect before this board. The door at the back of the room opened. Mina Holbrook came in. She was perhaps 40, with the specific composure of a woman who has been through something that stripped away every pretense and left only what was essential. She had traveled from Providence on a day's notice and showed nothing of it in her face or her bearing. She sat in the empty chair beside Judge Stanton and folded her hands on the table and looked at the room with the direct, steady gaze of a person who has said difficult things to difficult rooms before and has no fear of doing it again. "Good morning," she said. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was the silence of 7 men recalibrating everything they had understood about the morning. Monroe Caldwell arrived 11 minutes later. He had not been told the meeting had started early. He came in carrying the amended trust documents his uncle had given him to present to the board. The full documents, which he had finally and completely read the night before, sitting at his desk at midnight after Irene had gone to find Stanton. He had read them the way he should have read them in April, without stopping and without looking away from what they were designed to do. He came through the door and saw his wife at the head of his father's table. He saw the letter laid out before the board. He saw Mina Holbrook sitting beside Stanton in the corner, and he understood immediately who she was and what her presence meant. He saw his uncle's face, which was still controlled and working hard at it. Monroe set the amended trust documents on the table in front of Judge Stanton. He said, "These are the documents I was given to present to this board today. I believe they require review by independent counsel before this board takes any action." Webb said Monroe. "No." He said it without heat, without drama, and it landed in the room, with the weight of something that had been decided before he walked through the door. He did not look at his uncle again. He looked at Irene. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back to the board and said, "I believe we are ready to proceed." Judge Stanton filed the formal complaint with the Suffolk County Courts before the end of that week. Monroe gave testimony, full, specific, documented, about the 6 months of pressure from his uncle, the amended documents he had not properly read. The introductions he now understood had been engineered before he had known Irene's name. It was not comfortable testimony. He did not offer it to make himself comfortable. He offered it because it was true, and because in the plain arithmetic of the situation, he was the only person who could corroborate the timeline from inside the arrangement, and he owed Irene Caldwell at least the truth he had withheld for 6 months. Mina Holbrook gave her account in a formal deposition that lasted 4 hours, in the same direct voice she had used that morning at the board meeting, without omission and without performance. The Providence case, which the courts had been unable to address 3 years ago, because a single instance of voluntarily signed documents had no recourse, became a different matter when set beside the Brandt case. 2 documented incidents, the same operator, a timeline and a method that the court could not reasonably call coincidence. Chester Dodd's license to practice in Massachusetts was suspended pending investigation. Webb Caldwell's name appeared in the formal complaint filed with the Suffolk County Courts, where it would remain as part of the public record regardless of what followed. Irene did not dissolve the marriage. She held that possibility in her mind the way she held any decision with long consequences, turning it over, looking at its edges, considering what it cost and what it gave. She was 27 years old. The railroad shares were hers, confirmed and protected. The threat had been addressed. She was not required to do anything with Monroe Caldwell except what she chose. She chose to tell him the truth of what she had decided, 6 days after the board meeting, in the dining room after supper. "You were not the architect of what was done," she said, "but you were the door they walked through, and you left it open, and I need to be certain it will not stand open again." Monroe did not look away from her. "Yes. That means this. Anything that comes to your desk touching this household, this railroad, or any arrangement involving either of us, you bring it to me before you act on it. Not after you have decided it is not my concern. Before." I understand that. She looked at him across the table. He was not performing understanding. He was not searching for the version of agreement that would cost him least. He was simply there, across from her, entirely clear about what he had been and what he was being asked to become, and not flinching from either. Good, Irene said. Then we begin from there. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was honest, and she had spent enough of her life around things that were not honest to understand the difference. 6 months after that October Thursday, Irene was at her desk in the Marlborough Street study. Her desk now, moved from the back room to the room that had been her father's and was now hers, working through the quarterly freight contracts, with the same attention she had given them every quarter since Leonard Brandt's death. Mrs. Fowler brought coffee at 9:30, and did not comment on the 3 letters stacked at the corner of the desk. They were from Mina Holbrook. The Providence matter had reached a favorable resolution in the courts. Not a recovery of the stocks Mina had lost, which the legal structure had made permanently unreachable, but a formal censure of Dodd's methods that would follow him into every future arrangement he attempted. Mina had written to say so, in her direct, efficient way, and Irene had written back, and they had continued writing because the connection between them was worth the time. Monroe's study was across the hall. In the months since the board meeting they had begun to take their meals together, without the careful silence that had marked the early period. They talked about the freight contracts. They talked about his patience in the general terms he permitted himself. Occasionally they talked about nothing particular, which was its own kind of progress, arriving quietly in the way that honest things tend to arrive, without announcement, without drama, in the space between one day and the next. Irene turned to a fresh page in the ledger. Her father had taught her this, that what a person inherits is not only what is written in a will, or documented in a deed, or locked in an iron box. It is also the capacity to see clearly when everything around you is designed to make clarity difficult. It is the ability to act without flinching and to hold at the same time what has been done to you and what you choose to do about it, without letting either consume the other. He had taught her to open the ledger every morning and do the work. She opened it. She did the work.